Imagine, right? You wake up, you pour your coffee, and you open your morning newspaper. And the headlines are just, I mean, they are completely apocalyptic.
Oh, yeah, just absolute chaos everywhere you look.
Exactly. The United States has violently split in two. Russia is dealing with, like, these massive peasant revolts. There's an uprising in China that has killed literal millions.
It's a lot to process before breakfast, for sure.
Right. It's 1861, and the world is quite literally on fire. But here's the wild part. You've got these two stateless exiles sitting in this dusty, freezing flat in London, and they're trying to prove to the world that all this bloodshed, all of it, was actually caused by a banking crisis 4 years earlier.
Yeah, it is a staggering premise when you say it out loud like that. I mean, it sounds almost conspiratorial, but that is exactly what we find when we look at the historical output of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels during this really specific window of time.
And that, is our mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring volume 19 of the Marx and Engels collected works. So this covers their writings from January 1861 to June 1864.
Right, a very tight but intensely chaotic timeline.
Super chaotic. We are going to look at how they analyzed a world in global transition. So tracking their real-time journalism on the U.S. Civil War, their insights into global diplomacy, and like how this crazy era forged the foundational ideas of Marx's most famous economic theories.
Which is so fascinating because people usually separate the journalist Marx from the economist Marx,
Exactly. But before we get into all that, I just want to set the tone right at the top. Because we are dealing with highly charged political and revolutionary texts today, right? So our mission here is strictly analytical. We are acting as historical detectives. We are here to unpack what was written in these source texts and why it mattered in that specific historical moment. So we aren't taking sides, and we are not here to endorse the political ideologies presented in the text. We are just impartially reporting on how these two guys tried to make sense of a world spinning totally off its axis.
And I have to say, making sense of it was a monumental task. Like, the sheer volume of material in Volume 19 is incredibly dense.
Oh, I bet.
You have this rapid-fire journalism, detailed military analysis, and dense economic drafting all happening simultaneously, all while these massive world events are literally unfolding day by day. And they are writing for widely read newspapers, like the New York Daily Tribune and Die Press over in Vienna.
Okay, wait. I have to pause on the logistics of that for a second.
Huh.
How is that physically possible? I mean, they are churning out hundreds of articles synthesizing global news, but in 1861, the transatlantic telegraph cable isn't functioning yet, right?
No, it failed a few years earlier and wasn't reliably fixed until later.
Right. So news took, 10 to 14 days to travel by steamer ship across the Atlantic. How are they doing real-time analysis of a war in America while sitting in a pub in London?
It is a great question, and it really speaks to their methodology. They weren't just reacting to daily headlines because, like you said, they couldn't.
Yeah, the headlines were 2 weeks old.
Exactly. So they were analyzing structural trends instead. When a steamer arrived in Liverpool with, a stack of American newspapers, Marx and Engels weren't just flipping to the front page battle reports.
What were they looking at then?
They were reading congressional debates, they were pulling economic data on cotton exports, and looking at military supply manifests. Engels, with his military background, would analyze the terrain and troop movements based on those lagged reports.
Oh, okay.
And meanwhile, Marx would look at the political maneuvering happening in Washington. So they were essentially processing all this lagged data through a highly developed theoretical framework to predict where the conflict was inevitably heading.
That makes a lot of sense. And that theoretical framework starts with a truly massive claim, right? Because the sources paint the early 1860s as a time of huge bourgeois democratic and national liberation movements.
Yeah, they were everywhere.
But Marx and Engels argue these aren't isolated incidents. They link the push for national unity in Germany and Italy, the revolution in Mexico, the Taiping uprising in China, and all that unrest in Russia directly to the world economic crisis of 1857.
Yes. They basically argue that the 1857 crisis was this massive stress test for global capitalism, and it exposed all these inherent vulnerabilities.
So it wasn't just like a bad week on the stock market.
Oh, no, not at all. It was a fundamental disruption of trade, of credit, and of industrial production that rippled across all these borders. Because, when economies crash, the existing political structures instantly lose their legitimacy.
Right. People get angry when they can't afford bread.
Exactly.
Right.
The ruling classes then scramble to maintain control, often tightening their grip, which in turn breeds more resentment and radicalizes the masses. So Marx and Engels saw the political powder kegs of the 1860s as the delayed, but entirely inevitable reaction to the financial spark of 1857.
I was thinking about this, and if you think of the 1857 economic crisis as a massive offshore earthquake, you don't necessarily see the damage right away, right? You just feel a rumble.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it.
But the revolutions and the wars of the 1860s, those are the resulting tsunamis that finally hit the shores all over the world, like a few years later.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. The tectonic plates of the global economy shifted in 1857, and the political superstructures built on top of them were just destined to fracture.
Give me an example from the sources. How did this look in, say, Russia?
Okay, look at Russia. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolishes serfdom. Now, on paper, it looks like this great humanitarian reform.
Yeah, freeing the peasants sounds like a noble thing to do.
Right, but Marx analyzes this in his writings and argues it wasn't driven by morality at all. It was driven by the harsh economic realities exposed after 1857 and the Crimean War.
Oh, so they were broke.
Completely bankrupt. The Russian state desperately needed to modernize its agricultural economy just to compete with Western Europe. But here is the catch. The emancipation was structured to heavily burden the peasants with debt.
Wait, they had to pay for their own freedom?
Essentially, yes. They had to pay off their former masters for the land. And the result of that? Massive peasant unrest. The so-called economic fix triggered a massive political crisis.
Man, that is grim. And what about Mexico? The sources mention a bourgeois revolution triumphing there during this same window. What does that actually mean in the context of 1860s Mexico? Because, most people don't really associate 19th century Mexico with European-style bourgeois revolutions.
Yeah, the terminology can be a bit confusing. In Marx's terminology, a bourgeois revolution isn't necessarily about, factory owners in top hats taking over the government.
Right, that's the monopoly guy image I had in my head.
Yeah, no. It refers to the sweeping away of old feudal or colonial property relations to make way for modern capitalist development. So in Mexico, this was La Reforma, led by figures like Benito Juarez.
Okay, and what were they actually doing?
They were secularizing these massive tracts of land held by the Catholic Church and trying to establish a modern constitutional republic. But again, the 1857 global financial crisis had just dried up international credit completely.
I see where this is going.
Yeah. Mexico was broke and had to suspend payments on its foreign debt.
Wow.
This gave European powers, specifically France under Napoleon III, the perfect pretext to invade Mexico.
Just to collect the debt.
Well, to collect the debt, but also to try to install a puppet emperor, Maximilian, to secure a permanent, friendly foothold in the Americas.
So Juarez is just trying to build a modern state. The global economy crashes. He can't pay the national debt because the world is broke. And suddenly French troops are marching on Mexico City.
Precisely. And Marx is covering all of this, showing his readers in Europe that you cannot understand the French invasion of Mexico without understanding the debt crisis.
Right.
And you cannot understand the debt crisis without understanding the global interconnectedness of capital. The exact same logic applied to the Taiping uprising in China, which was simultaneously reaching its really bloody conclusion right around this time.
How is 1857 connect to China, though? That seems so far removed.
Marx noted how the forced opening of Chinese markets by British guns in the Opium Wars, combined with those global trade fluctuations, utterly destabilized the ancient agrarian economy of the Qing dynasty.
Wow.
Yeah, and that economic devastation led directly to a peasant rebellion that claimed tens of millions of lives.
I mean, if you were a reader in London in 1861, this has to be terrifying. News is just pouring in from Italy, from Russia, from Mexico, from China. It just sounds like the literal end of the world.
It really does, and that is the exact problem Marx and Engels were trying to solve for their readers. Their journalism was an attempt to find the underlying logic in all that terror.
To make it make sense.
Exactly. They provided a framework. If you understand the underlying economic engine, the seemingly random political explosions start to make a lot of sense.
Yet, while the whole world was shaking, there was one specific conflict that absolutely dominated their journalistic efforts during this period. The American Civil War.
Absolutely.
Volume 19 contains their first systematic account of the war's history, its political ramifications, and its economic consequences.
Yes. They viewed the U.S. Civil War as a crucial turning point with what the texts literally call overall progressive significance for the entire world.
See, I struggle to buy that, though.
Really? Why?
Well, if Marx's entire philosophical project is obsessively focused on the industrial working class, the factory workers of Europe, why would he care so deeply about an agrarian civil war in America?
I see what you mean.
Like, isn't spending 3 years writing about Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis just a massive distraction from his core economic theories regarding industrial capitalism?
It totally seems like a distraction until you understand how Marx viewed the global supply chain of the 19th century. He did not view the U.S. Civil War as a domestic American dispute.
How did he see it then?
He framed it as an inevitable existential clash between two entirely distinct, completely incompatible economic systems that were fighting for control of a continent.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Sure, on one side you have the capitalist wage labor system of the North. On the other, the slave labor system of the South, ruled by this deeply entrenched, as he called it, oligarchy of slave owners.
But why couldn't they just coexist? I mean, they had coexisted for 80 years at that point. Why did it suddenly break down in 1861?
Marx argued they had reached a geographical and economic breaking point. The slave economy of the South was inherently expansionist by nature.
Because of the cotton.
Exactly. Growing cotton exhausted the soil incredibly rapidly, meaning the Southern planter class constantly needed new virgin territory just to maintain their profit margins.
Ah, so they literally couldn't stay put.
Right. If they couldn't expand into the Western territories, the slave economy would eventually suffocate and die. But the North, conversely, needed those exact same Western territories for free soil, free labor, and the expansion of industrial infrastructure, like railroads.
Okay, so they both needed the same land for completely opposite economic models.
Yes, Marx saw that these two systems could no longer share the same continent.
So it's a total zero-sum game. The South has to expand to survive, and the North has to contain them to protect its own economic future.
Exactly. And by extension, this impacted the entire world. Marx and Engels really believed that the survival of the American Democratic Republic, and specifically the total destruction of slavery, was a necessary precondition for any future working-class movements globally.
Wait, really? They tied European workers' rights to American abolition?
Oh, completely. They argued that a massive, wealthy empire built entirely on chattel slavery, dragging down wages and basic human dignity, would forever stifle the progress of free labor everywhere else. In Marx's view, as long as labor in a black skin was branded and sold, labor in a white skin could never truly emancipate itself.
Wow, that really reframes the entire conflict. They are linking the fate of the European working class directly to the abolition of slavery in America.
They really are. And they didn't just write broad, sweeping economic theory about it either. Engels, drawing on his military background, was writing detailed tactical analyses of the conflict.
Yeah, the sources include pieces like Artillery News from America, which just sounds so incredibly niche.
It is, but in it, Engels is meticulously breaking down the military preparedness of the global forces. He is comparing the rifled artillery being developed in Britain with the older smoothbore cannons being used in the early battles of the Civil War.
He's getting really deep into the weeds.
Oh, he's analyzing logistics, supply lines, and troop movements, treating this war as the absolute center of gravity for global history at that exact moment.
So let's zoom in on a specific moment in this war that really highlights Marx's analytical approach, because the sources dedicate a lot of space to a Union commander named General John C. Fremont.
Oh, yes. The dismissal of Fremont. This is such a fascinating micro-study within Volume 19.
Let me just give a bit of context for you listening.
Yeah.
John C. Fremont, known as the Pathfinder, was this very famous explorer and politician. And in the fall of 1861, he is the commander-in-chief for the Union in the Department of the West, basically trying to hold the state of Missouri for the Union. And suddenly, out of nowhere, President Lincoln relieves him of his command, and Marx writes an entire article specifically dissecting this single event.
He did, because Marx identified Fremont's dismissal as a major turning point in the ideological history of the war. To understand why, we really have to look at what Marx called Fremont's two great sins.
Okay, what was the first sin?
First, Fremont had been the original Republican presidential candidate back in 1856, so he had a massive national profile, making him a serious political rival to Lincoln.
Right, so there's some political jealousy there maybe, but it's the second sin that actually gets him fired, right?
Yes, absolutely. In August 1861, Fremont issues a military proclamation declaring martial law in Missouri. And completely on his own authority, without consulting Washington at all, he threatens the rebellious slaveholders in his jurisdiction with the outright emancipation of their slaves.
Whoa. So he was the very first Northern general to explicitly use emancipation as a weapon of war.
He was.
He crossed the ultimate political red line.
He absolutely did. And Marx unpacks the reaction to this brilliantly. Because in the early days of the war, the North, and specifically Lincoln's administration, was desperate to frame the conflict strictly as a constitutional war to preserve the Union.
Right. They were terrified of framing it as an abolitionist war to end slavery because they were paranoid about the border states. States like Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri itself. These states still allowed slavery, but had stayed in the Union. If the war officially becomes a crusade to end slavery, Lincoln instantly loses those states to the Confederacy.
Precisely. There's a famous quote where Lincoln reportedly said he hoped to have God on his side, but he must have Kentucky.
Wow, yeah, that sums it up perfectly.
Right. The Union leadership was walking a terrifying diplomatic tightrope. So they were acting, in Marx's words, as makers of compromises. They wanted to fight this sanitized war, literally returning runaway slaves to their masters in border states just to keep the political peace.
And then Fremont comes along and completely shatters that illusion.
Exactly. He forces the issue. He says, essentially, we're fighting slaveholders. The single most effective military strategy to defeat them is to strip them of their enslaved workforce.
It honestly reminds me of corporate whistleblower. You know, someone inside an organization who sees the ugly reality of a situation, says the quiet part out loud to the press, and immediately gets fired by the board of directors for being too right too soon.
Oh, that's a highly accurate parallel.
Fremont exposed the fundamental moral and economic truth of the conflict before the leadership in Washington was politically ready to admit it.
He was punished for prematurely forcing the reality of the war into the open.
But if you are reading this in Europe, this has to be incredibly confusing.
Yeah.
Europeans, especially the working classes Marx was writing for, were generally very anti-slavery. How does Marx explain this hesitation by the North? Because I imagine a European reader might just assume, well, the North is fighting the South. The North must be fighting to end slavery from day one.
That is exactly the misconception Marx is trying to correct for his audience. He uses the Fremont dismissal to show his European readers that the Northern government is initially hesitant, they're moderate, and they are paralyzed by political calculation.
He's showing them the messy reality.
Right. He is pointing out that the true revolutionary nature of the war, the inevitable destruction of slavery, is bubbling up from the ground. It's coming from the actions of commanders in the field and the brutal, unavoidable realities of the conflict, rather than being dictated from the top down by the politicians in Washington.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. He is telling his readers to watch the objective mechanics of the war, not just the official rhetoric of the diplomats. He predicts, very early on, that the war must become an abolitionist war, regardless of Lincoln's early hesitations, simply because the economic logic of the conflict demands it.
So Lincoln is walking this tightrope, terrified of alienating the border states with emancipation. But while he is focused on managing his domestic borders, a completely different crisis is brewing in the mid-Atlantic that threatens to drag the British Navy right to his doorstep.
Oh, yes. The Civil War did not stay contained within the borders of the United States. It spilled over into the oceans and deeply into the economy of Europe, causing a massive diplomatic crisis. The sources focus heavily on this tension, which they refer to as the diplomatic chessboard.
We have to talk about the Trent case first, right? Because that almost started World War II.
Oh, it came incredibly close.
Basically, Union forces intercept a British mail ship, the Trent, and arrest two Confederate diplomats, Mason and Slidell, who were on their way to Europe to seek recognition for the South.
Yeah.
And Britain is absolutely outraged. But the sources also highlight a lesser-known, yet absolutely wild event from the same period, the Nashville incident.
Yes, the Nashville incident is incredibly revealing about the true stance of the British government. So in November 1861, a Confederate privateer ship called the Nashville attacked a Union merchant ship, the Harvey Birch, right out in the Atlantic.
Okay, standard naval warfare stuff.
Right, but the Confederates burnt the Union ship to the waterline, captured the crew, and then amazingly sailed right into the British port of Southampton to take cover and resupply.
Which is a massive violation of the spirit of neutrality, right?
Yeah.
Letting a rebel raider use your ports as a safe haven.
Oh, completely. And it gets worse. A Union cruiser, the Tuscarora, tracks the Nashville down to Southampton. So you have a Confederate raider and a heavily armed Union warship just staring each other down in a neutral British port.
Just waiting to blast each other.
Exactly. The British authorities, claiming strict neutrality under the Foreign Enlistment Act, order both ships to leave. But here's the mechanism they used. Under international maritime law at the time, if two belligerent vessels were in a neutral port, there had to be a 24-hour delay between their departures.
Okay, again, that sounds like a reasonable rule to prevent naval battles in your front yard.
It does sound reasonable until you see how they actually applied it. The British authorities deliberately allowed the Confederate Nashville to leave first and then legally detained the Union ship, the Tuscarora, in port for 24 hours.
Are you kidding? Just to give the Confederate ship a massive head start to escape into the open ocean.
Yes. They strategically applied the neutrality rule to ensure the Confederate raider got away.
Okay, let's start with geopolitics.
Geopolitically, a divided America was a weaker America. The U.S. was a rapidly rising commercial and naval rival to the British Empire. If the nation permanently split in two, it neutralized a major competitor on the global stage.
Right, it's the classic imperial strategy. Let them divide themselves so you remain the undisputed hegemon.
Exactly. But geopolitics is abstract. The second factor, cotton, was deeply tangible.
Oh, right, the textile mills.
Absolutely. The British textile industry, which was the booming engine of their entire industrial revolution, was overwhelmingly dependent on cheap cotton harvested by enslaved labor in the American South.
So when the war starts, what happens?
Well, when Lincoln ordered a naval blockade of southern ports to choke off their economy, it also choked off the cotton supply to Europe. This led to what became known as the Cotton Crisis, or the Cotton Famine in England.
The sources refer to this as the crisis in England and the distress and relief in Lancashire. What did that actually look like on the ground for the people living there?
It was economically devastating. Truly horrific. Without raw cotton, the massive mills in Lancashire and across the industrial north of England literally ran out of material and just ground to a halt. Hundreds of thousands of mill workers were suddenly thrown out of work.
Just overnight.
Overnight. Families were pawning their furniture just to buy bread. Soup kitchens were completely overwhelmed. People were literally starving in the streets.
That is awful.
And here's where the politics gets really ugly. The conservative press in Britain, powerful papers like The Times, used this domestic suffering to agitate aggressively for British military intervention.
Oh.
They argued, essentially, our people are starving because of Lincoln's blockade. We must intervene, use the Royal Navy to break the blockade, officially recognize the Confederacy, and get the cotton flowing again to save our workers.
They're essentially telling starving British workers, we need to go to war against the American North to save your job. That is incredibly potent political pressure. I mean, if my kids are starving, I might support whoever promises to turn the factories back on. How did the workers react to that?
This is one of the most remarkable moments of international working-class solidarity in history, and Marx covers it extensively. Despite the immense personal suffering, despite losing their livelihoods and facing actual starvation, the English working classes overwhelmingly rejected the pro-Confederate propaganda from their own press and politicians.
Oh, really? They didn't take the bait?
No. They organized massive pro-America and anti-intervention meetings across the country, most notably at places like St. Martin's Hall in London. They drafted resolutions supporting the North and praising Lincoln's emancipation efforts, especially once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued.
That's incredible.
They effectively formed an immovable political wall of public opinion that prevented the British government from intervening on the side of the South.
They are essentially saying, we will starve before we accept cotton picked by enslaved hands to run our mills. That is profound moral and political courage.
It really was, and for Marx, it was profound vindication. For years, he had been theorizing about class consciousness, the idea that the working class could act politically based on a shared global interest rather than just narrow, immediate self-interest.
And here it was happening right in front of him.
Exactly. He reported on these meetings meticulously in his articles for Die Presse. He contrasted the venality and the secret backroom maneuvers of the British aristocracy with the heroic, self-sacrificing stance of the mill workers.
It's quite a contrast.
He used it to show his continental readers that the English working class was not a passive victim of economic forces, but an active, conscious political agent capable of seeing past their immediate hunger to a broader international struggle for human freedom.
I love that.
Yeah.
But I'm lost on one thing, though.
Sure. What is it?
How does a crisis in cotton and a blockade in America lead to Marx writing his defining economic text, Capital? Because the sources outline a very specific timeline here.
They do.
While he is writing these dispatches about British naval maneuvers and starving mill workers, he is simultaneously undertaking his most vital theoretical work. Like, from August 1861 to July 1863, he is writing a contribution to the critique of political economy.
Right.
And then immediately following that, from mid-1863 to the summer of 1864, he begins drafting Book One of Capital.
Yes, the process of capitalist production. He is just filling a notebook after notebook with dense economic theory.
Again, the logistics here are staggering to me. It seems mentally impossible to be writing thousands of pages of abstract economic theory regarding surplus value while simultaneously tracking the movements of privateer ships in Southampton.
Mm-hmm.
Are these two separate tracks of his life, or do the sources show his journalism influencing his economic theory?
Oh, it is an entirely reciprocal relationship. You really cannot separate the two. The events he was reporting on for the newspapers were the exact real-world empirical data he needed to prove the theories he was developing in his notebooks.
Okay, take me through that. What is the mechanism there? How does a starving mill worker in Lancashire translate into the dense economic theory of capital?
Okay, let's look at the core theoretical problem Marx was trying to solve in his economic drafts during this exact window of 1861 to 1863. He was trying to prove how surplus value, which we would generally just call profit, is generated in a capitalist system without violating the classical law of value.
Okay, I need a brief definition here.
Yeah.
What exactly is the law of value?
Right, so in classical economics, the law of value essentially states that commodities are exchanged in the market at their true value, which is based on the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce them.
Okay, so a chair that takes 10 hours to make costs more than a chair that takes 1 hour.
Exactly. But economists before Marx couldn't reconcile this with profit, because if everything in the market is traded fairly for exactly what it's worth, where does the extra money, the profit, come from?
Right. Because if I buy $10 worth of wood and I build a chair and I sell that chair for $20, I added $10 of value with my labor. It's a fair exchange. Where is the underlying exploitation that Marx is always talking about?
And that was the puzzle. Marx cracked this code by deeply analyzing a specific commodity, which he termed labor capacity in these early drafts, and later translated as labor power. He realized that the capitalist doesn't actually buy the worker's labor, which is the actual work being done, like the physical act of building your chair.
What are they buying then?
The capitalist buys the worker's capacity to labor for a set amount of time.
Okay, so they aren't buying the chair, they're buying my time.
Exactly. And how do you determine the value of that time? The value of labor capacity is determined by what it takes to keep the worker alive and functioning.
Do you mean like food and rent?
Yes. Food, shelter, clothing, and enough to raise a family so there's a next generation of workers. Let's say it takes 4 hours of work in a factory to produce enough value to pay for those basic necessities.
Okay, 4 hours of work covers my wages to survive for the day.
Right. But the capitalist hasn't bought 4 hours of your time. They bought your labor capacity for a 12-hour shift.
Oh.
Yeah. So those remaining 8 hours. The worker continues to produce value, but that value goes entirely to the capitalist. That is surplus value.
I see.
The exchange was technically fair, according to the rules of the free market, because the capitalist paid the market rate for the worker's time to keep them alive. But the mechanical process inherently generates surplus value through the exploitation of those extra 8 hours.
That is a massive breakthrough in economic thought. But how does the real world of the 1860s, specifically the cotton crisis, inform this theory?
Because the global supply chain disruptions of the 1860s perfectly illustrated the brutality and the fragility of this exact system in real time, Marx was watching hundreds of thousands of English mill workers literally starve.
And why were they starving?
Because their labor capacity was suddenly worthless to the capitalist, since the raw material, the cotton, was cut off by the American blockade. The factory owners weren't starving, right? They had accumulated the surplus value of the workers' past decades of labor.
Right, they had savings, they had capital.
But the workers had nothing to fall back on. The crisis laid bare the reality that the workers were treated as just another input commodity, to be completely discarded the moment the supply chain broke. Marx was cracking the theoretical code of how capitalism functioned right as global capitalism was experiencing a massive, highly visible stress test.
Puzzle pieces were all falling into place.
Exactly. His journalism provided the raw, bloody data, and his notebooks provided the theoretical structure.
It's like a meteorologist who is trying to invent the mathematical theory of barometric pressure, But he's doing it while standing outside in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane.
That's it, exactly. He's observing the extreme weather events of the global economy, revolutions, civil wars, mass starvation, and using them to prove the underlying climate science of how capital actually moves.
Now, this hurricane wasn't just theoretical for Marx. It was deeply, deeply personal.
Oh, absolutely.
We have to talk about his real-world struggles during this highly productive period because he was not sitting in a cushy ivory tower enjoying academic tenure.
Far from it. Marx was a stateless exile living in London. He had been kicked out of Germany, France, and Belgium for his political activities in the 1840s.
He was basically a wanted man across Europe.
Yeah, pretty much. And during the early 1860s, he was often living in extreme poverty, relying heavily on financial help from Engels, who was working at his father's textile firm in Manchester just to feed his family.
And the sources highlight a specific attempt Marx made to change his situation during this exact timeline. Because following the Prussian amnesty of 1861, he actually tries to go back to Germany.
Yes. In 1861, Wilhelm I becomes King of Prussia and declares a political amnesty. So Marx actually travels to Berlin. He applies for the formal restoration of his Prussian citizenship.
Why did he want to go back so badly?
He wanted to return to Germany permanently because he saw the revolutionary crisis approaching. Specifically, the unification of Germany was looming on the horizon, and he wanted to be on the ground.
He wanted to be back in the arena.
Exactly. He wanted to engage in active political work, maybe editing a socialist newspaper there.
But it doesn't work out.
No. The Berlin police president, a man named von Zedlitz, flatly rejects his applications. They view him as far too dangerous a radical to let back into the country.
Even with the amnesty.
Even with the amnesty. So he is denied citizenship. He is forced to return to England. He is trapped in London.
The historical irony here is just staggering to me.
It is the ultimate irony of history. Think about what would have happened if the Berlin police president had just stamped his papers and said, sure, come on back, Karl.
Everything would be different.
Marx likely would have become a localized German politician or a regional newspaper editor. He would have been dragged into the daily, minute-by-minute squabbles of German domestic politics and the complicated maneuvering around Bismarck.
He would have been bogged down in local issues.
But because he was rejected...
Because he was forced into continued exile in London, which was, let's remember, the absolute heart of the British Empire. The center of global finance, the hub of world trademarks, was forced to maintain his global perspective.
Yes. And he had daily access to the British Museum's reading room.
Which was huge, right?
Massive. It was filled with the economic data, the parliamentary reports, and the factory inspector logs of the largest empire on Earth.
Yeah.
And he was surrounded by political exiles from Poland, Italy, France, and America.
Wow.
By trapping him in London, the Prussian police inadvertently placed him in the one city on Earth where he had the vantage point, the data, and the isolation to actually write capital.
It's the ultimate closed door leading to an open window moment. And, you know, there's a lesson in there for you listening to this. When you feel blocked by bureaucratic red tape or a brutal job rejection or just life circumstances that completely derail your plans, remember this moment. Being forced out of your intended path might inadvertently place you exactly where you need to be to do your most impactful work.
It's a great takeaway.
I mean, if Marx goes back to Berlin, maybe he gets bogged down in local elections. Maybe we never get capital. And maybe we don't get the first international.
Right, because that is the other major outcome of his forced exile. Because his focus remains strictly international, he spent the end of this period laying the groundwork for the International Workingmen's Association.
Also known as the First International.
Exactly. Which officially kicks off right at the end of Volume 19's timeline in the fall of 1864, fittingly, at St. Martin's Hall in London.
Wait, isn't that where the mill workers had their meetings?
It is. He takes the incredible working-class solidarity he witnessed during the cotton crisis, you know, those starving English workers supporting the American North, and attempts to formalize it into a permanent global organization.
Which fundamentally changes the course of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Undeniably. It took the theoretical solidarity he wrote about in his journalism and attempted to make it a material political force.
So let's recap this wild ride we've been on. We started in a world on fire from 1861 to 1864.
A very chaotic few years.
Very. We looked at how Marx and Engels used rapid-fire, data-driven journalism to find the hidden economic logic behind global revolutions from Russia to Mexico. We saw their brutally insightful analysis of the American Civil War, viewing it not just as a tragic domestic dispute, but as an existential, unavoidable clash between wage labor and slave labor with massive global implications.
Truly global.
We unpacked the hypocritical diplomatic chess games of the British Empire during the Trent and Nashville incidents and the stunning moral courage of the starving English mill workers.
Which is such an inspiring piece of history.
It really is. And we saw how, through all of this, a stateless exile trapped in London used the chaos of a broken global supply chain to quietly draft one of the most influential economic texts in human history.
It is a breathtaking 3 years of intellectual output. It just shows a mind synthesizing military tactics, diplomacy, and abstract economics all at once.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, based on how these two men viewed the world. Remember how they saw the 1857 economic crisis as the true, hidden catalyst for the political revolutions of the 1860s?
Right, the earthquake before the tsunami.
Exactly. It forces you to look at the world today and ask a difficult question. When we see sudden, massive political upheavals or intense cultural shifts or unexpected conflicts dominating the news cycle, are we just looking at the surface symptoms?
Usually, yes.
What hidden economic shockwaves from years prior actually set those events in motion? When you look out the window and see the world on fire, ask yourself,
Yeah.
where did the tectonic plates actually shift?